The next segment in history we come to in terms of God's Hall of Faith is what I would call the Christian Middle Ages. The Christian Middle Ages, maybe the 6th to the 10th centuries. Now, this is oftentimes called in history the Dark Ages, and it was dark in the sense of Greek-Roman Empire collapsing because all the barbarians, the Vandals from Europe, came down upon the southern part of Europe and destroyed everything. And one of the things they destroyed was all the books, almost all the books. We lost almost all of history during that time period, which is why they call it dark. And that was a tremendous loss, and it plunged the world into many aspects of darkness. But an awful lot of light began to come out of it too, and that was especially through monks and monasteries during this time period. And you can't understand Christian history without understanding how the monks and the monasteries basically resurrected Europe and built a Christian civilization that would eventually then go to the ends of the earth. So the barbarian invasion took place over a number of centuries. The Roman Empire collapsed. The libraries were destroyed. The barbarians took over everything. The other major thing that happened during that time period was the birth of Islam. Islam kind of came into that vacuum. When the church had kind of become institutionalized, Rome had collapsed, and so Muhammad was born. 570 in the 6th century, lived till 632. And Islam began to conquer many of the lands of the Bible by force. So you have the European barbarians, and then you have the Islamic barbarians, all using force to kill thousands and thousands, if not millions of people. So we come to the 6th century, during which this is beginning to take place. Number 19 I want to mention, I'll call this the Irish monks that were followers of Patrick. I'll give you actually 3 names. One was a guy whose name was Columcille, spelled with a C at the end, C-I-L-L-E, Columcille. Another guy was named Aidan, A-I-D-A-N, Aidan. And another one was called Columbanus, just like it sounds, Columbanus. These were 3 very famous Irish missionaries that came out from Scotland and Ireland and England, and they began to set up monasteries all over those places first, and then eventually all throughout Europe, even going down into the southern parts of Europe. And one of their big things was to find the books and transcribe the books, to rewrite the books, to find the Bible and retranslate it, the Vulgate and other kinds of things that have been lost. And they were utterly incredible. The book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, is stunning. How God used this movement way up in the British Isles to basically awaken an entire continent and restore much of the literature. I mean, a lot of it lost. That's why we actually have no book manuscripts, hardly, in history that go back more than 1,000 years. Because what was wiped out during the Dark Ages. The only remnants we have and fragments we have are of the monks who collected these things and began to copy them and transcribe them and basically gave the world back literature, history, learning, and especially the Bible. Number 20 on our list is Benedict, who was a monk in Italy. And you may have heard of his Benedictine rule. He basically wrote this little book, 73 short chapters, that was really the rebirth of Christian community. And eventually they established these wonderful little centers of learning and agriculture and community all throughout various countries, what we now call Europe. The main part of the Benedictine rule was, Christ may bring us all together. Christ may bring us all together. It was really a rebirth of the early life of the early church in a feudal form in Europe. Number 21 on our list, again another member of the Hall of Faith, is I'm going to pull in a pope here. By this time, they're popes, you know, and the church became institutionalized, and a lot of things related to that we don't have time to talk about. But one of the good popes, one of the great popes, was a guy named Gregory the Great, who lived during the 6th century. He's called by many the father of Christian worship, a man who loved to worship. In fact, I think some of you can recognize where his name leads to the Gregorian chant, which was used for hundreds of years throughout Europe. He also was one of the first to send missionaries to England, specifically. In fact, he sent a man named Augustine, who was the first one to really share his faith in what we call England today. And Pope Gregory the Great also had a tremendous heart for the poor. And many of the hospitals and other things that would take place in subsequent time periods kind of came from his example of Christians care about the poor and needy. That was actually a foreign concept in the Roman Empire and in feudal Europe. And of course, it's always been a heart of Christian truth. In the 7th and 8th centuries, there are also a number of people I want to mention here. Number 22 is a man named Willibrord. Willibrord. A lot of these guys have only one name, right? They're different from our time period. But Willibrord was an English missionary to Holland. Holland became actually a great Christian nation in many ways because of the sacrificial labors of this man who was the first one to take the gospel there, as far as we know. And then another one, a little more known to history, is Boniface. Boniface, you maybe heard that name, number 23. His original name was Winfrith. He was basically the first missionary to Germany, which is kind of where half of my roots come from. He's also, by the way, the guy where the origin of the Christmas tree comes from. If you've never heard that story, Boniface was actually preaching out in a tree grove. In ancient pagan Europe, they worshiped trees and they named trees after gods, and they made sacrifices underneath trees, even human sacrifices during that time period. And Boniface was preaching under the oak of Thor. And then to kind of show that it had no magical power, he took a swing to chop it down. It's a huge tree. And of course, nothing happened. He was going to show that he was greater than the gods. But as the story goes, a wind came at that very moment. The tree came down. It split into 4 almost exact, appendages representing a cross. And what was left in the center was one little evergreen. And it was so supernatural and so miraculous that the heathen there converted. It was actually the birth of Christianity in Germany. And it became the center of stories in which they began to teach that Christ be the center of your homes. And they began to put evergreen trees in their homes with apples or candy on them that today have become the Christmas tree of today. That came out of missionary endeavor by Boniface into Germany. These are the 7th and 8th centuries. During this time period, we also have a man named Charles Martel, who was an emperor during that time period. The reason we mention him is because a very famous battle took place in 732, in which the invading Islamic armies were stopped in Europe. The world would have been totally different if the Muslims would have taken over Europe at that time. We would probably be living in a global Islamic caliphate if it weren't for a Christian emperor named Charles Martel. And later on, his grandson became a famous figure in history whose name is Charlemagne. Charlemagne, Charles the Great. That was in the year 800. And he basically kind of revived some of the pure and holy aspects, the godly aspects of the Roman Empire, and in now modernizing Europe, in which the monks are doing their things and people are coming to Christ, and civilization is being reborn and culture is being developed, and eventually a Reformation, Renaissance, a lot of things would come. But these people had parts in that, in God's hall of faith. In the 9th century, we find just a couple individuals I want to mention here. One is called in history the Venerable Bede. His name is Bede, B-E-D-E. The Venerable Bede. We only know about actually how the gospel came to England through a book he wrote, which was the story of the conversions of the Anglo-Saxons. And of course, Anglo-Saxons were the kind of combinations of Germans and English. And his book set the stage for godliness and many other things to happen in England. And we're going to learn later on, it was from England that much of the world changed and the gospel exploded worldwide. So Bede was the one that told us the story of how the original Anglo-Saxons gave their lives to Jesus. Number 26 is a man named Ansgar. Ansgar lived around the time of 826, and he started one of the first churches, if not the first church, in Sweden. This was during the time of the Vikings. The Vikings were kind of conquering many parts of Europe as part of the chaos of that time period. But one of the positive things about the Vikings is they came into various nations, and they took wives back to Denmark and Sweden and Norway, and a lot of those wives were Christians. And so Christian influence came into those lands, and by the 9th century, the first church had been planted in Sweden. And number 26, during the same time period, a man named Boris and a man named Simeon. in the 9th century, about 864, were greatly involved in seeing the conversion of the Slavic peoples in Bulgaria. So during this Christian Middle Age time period, a lot was going on. Rome had collapsed. Islam was kind of taking off. The monks were kind of gathering up the books and re-putting together civilization. Missionaries were beginning to go forth into lands that, of course, had been totally pagan. You know, we tend to think of Europe as kind of a great place that's civilized and all this, but Europe was as pagan, as heathen as anything was, 1,500 years ago. It was just completely lost, worshiping devils, demons. In fact, in this book by Thomas Cahill, it shows many of the aspects of child sacrifice, the druids, the horrific pornography, and all the stuff that Europe was filled with before the gospel came. And during this time period, basically, God was developing a Christian civilization, which would be a springboard, really, toward them blessing the entire world.